presentation, so,
Okay.
shall we?
Yes, please.
Yeah.
It's videotaping, so just.
Okay, great. Well, thanks for giving me a chance to talk about what I've been working on literally for 20 plus years. And I know some folks, I'll just say up front, folks are saying, well, wait, they're not all done, so how can you say 20 plus years? But there's a lot of work that goes into the planning of a Section 10 permit. A habitat conservation plan, which I'll get into in a couple slides, is actually a small part of a federal permit. So there's a lot of work that goes into that up front. So this is actually, we did a really cool breeding study up at Loch Lomond a few years ago. This is one of our 3 female western pond turtles that we actually got to know them quite well over the course of a year because we had transmitters on them and we followed the movements all day long for a year and found them doing things that we didn't know pond turtles did. So that was kind of cool. And that was all part of the background research for the HCP.
Did you glue it to the shell?
We did glue it to the shell, and we agonized quite a lot over what kind of glue to use, and yeah, it was way more interesting than I would have expected. And the turtles even learned to avoid the traps. There were some turtles that actually were like, yeah, we're down, we want some sardines, and then other turtles, obviously, we could actually see their movement, so they'd go up to the trap, and then they'd be like, no, we're not going back in there. So I think they're silly reptiles, but they're actually pretty amusing creatures. So just a little overview, as I was saying, what I'm working on is Endangered Species Act compliance for the City of Santa Cruz Water Department. I'm also helping a little bit with Public Works because they have less environmental regulatory support staffing than the Water Department has, and a lot of our issues overlap. And frankly, we just want to make sure that what they're doing works well with what we're planning to. So just case in point, if we're putting water into the lower river to improve steelhead rearing habitat, we want to make sure there's still some vegetation along the banks. It is a flood control channel, so we just want the right hand speaking to the left hand. These are long-term permits. 30 years is actually on the short side. Some people do 50-year permits. We have a hard time projecting out that far, so we're keeping it simple, dare I say, with 30 years. Multiple species. We hear a lot about steelhead and coho, but it's not just about steelhead and coho, which is why I put my favorite pond turtle on the front.
Question, would you like us to hold questions to the end, or would you?
You know what,
take
I'm
some
happy to
pepper
answer them
questions
along
as
the
we go
way,
through
as long as we
slide
don't
by
get too
slide?
far
Okay.
off script.
Great, thanks.
So, if that's okay with the chair.
No,
No?
sorry, no, go ahead. I was just thinking, he had to decide whether to ask that now or at the end of the meeting.
It's true. He's a very polite person, so.
That's true.
And people are sometimes critical of HCPs, but they also are a great tool for regional conservation. So they do present some opportunities, mostly because they provide long-term funding that's reliable. And I know folks at UCSC have worked on some HCPs, and they probably understand that better than a lot of folks. And we're hoping that that will come true mostly for our fisheries HCP, because that one's going to be super expensive, and it does present some opportunities. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later.
Can you talk about why people resist the idea of habitat conservation plans?
Yeah, some people feel that you should not ever be allowed to take, and I use take in quotes, just like I did up on the screen, an endangered species. It's sort of a philosophical question for them. The reality is we have to provide water for 95,000 people, and we use the same water that these species use. So we want to do our best by the species, but we also have to somehow provide for public health and safety too. So in order to run our water system, we have to have take authorization. Some people would just assume that 50,000 people in Santa Cruz move back to New Hampshire like me, and then our water situation wouldn't be as bad. Frankly, even if 50,000 people moved away, we would still have issues with endangered species conflicts. So, and we actually, in our modeling, we compare our impacts to our basically unimpaired conditions. So that's something interesting that we'll look at a little further down the road. So an HCP is a planning document. It's part of an incidental take permit. Catch me if I start reading the slides, because I hate it when people do that. So, but I just want to make that clear. It's a big piece of that permit, but It's only one part of it. We're including species other than endangered and threatened species, like the pond turtle. It's considered a species of special concern on the state list, has no federal status, and likely won't until we have a new president. That's for the record, Becky. They have been proposed for federal listing, but they haven't been listed yet. And it's funny, some herpetologists think they really don't deserve listing, and others are very adamant that they do. So there's quite a lot of, there's divided opinions about that. We're including other non-listed species like lamprey, which a lot of people think are eels. They're not eels. I just want to get that off my chest. They're pretty amazing creatures as well, and several other species which I'll show you in a future slide. So we need to describe our activities. The biggest one I'm working on is diversion of water and what its effects are in terms of take of these species or their habitat, and then how we can minimize those effects and how we can compensate for effects that we can't minimize. So I'll get into the details a little bit more on that later too. And one of the biggest things is we have to demonstrate funding for the length of the permit. And so this summer, I literally pretended to be a bean counter and figured out the budget for the fisheries HCP through the whole term of the HCP, and it's close to $40 million in 2018 dollars. So that will require a rate increase, which means there's a public, political component of this, of course, beyond the environmental protection values that folks may have. There's a real ratepayer, back and forth that has to happen with that. So, and this is actually an HCP that we have, an incidental take permit that we're implementing now. I just slapped the hands of some maintenance people yesterday for, frankly, pushing the envelope on some of the terms of this permit. So we are implementing this now. It's a fairly simple HCP. I kind of call it the training HCP. That's for the Mount Herman June beetle at the Grand Hill Water Treatment Plant. So it just turns out that the treatment plant is about on the southern edge of the June beetle's habitat, and the neighbors around us probably don't know that because they're doing all kinds of things that they shouldn't. But we're doing what we're supposed to. And it's interesting that the only reason I knew we had June beetles there is because the operators who were there 24 hours a day got bored and one night and were having beetle wars on their desk. So they had the 10-line June beetle and the Mount Herman June beetle, and they thought that was great fun to have the beetles fight each other. And I came in one day and I was like, that's a federally listed species. And they said, who's the new guy?
Right. Way to make a reputation.
I know. They didn't invite me out for beers that night. So this is what take means. Take is not just killing an endangered species, it's having beetle wars. It's distracting them from their breeding behavior, that's actually a big deal at the treatment plant. It's a 24-hour secured facility with lights everywhere. You can see it from Poganip if you go up to Poganip at night, although I don't advise it because it's not safe. We have to use special lights, or we turn down the lights to prevent the beetles from getting distracted from their thing, because it's only a few nights of summer they come out and they breed. So if they miss a night because they're distracted by the lights, that's actually a huge impact. Yeah.
How do you know what kind of light distracts a beetle? It doesn't
Well, there's actually all kinds of bug-friendly lights. It's not rocket science. Mount Herman is supposed to have bug-friendly lights, according to their secret document for their expansion. Various other facilities that have gone through a regulatory process have had to deal with this, so it's not rocket science. The harder part is getting buy-in from your organizational system, and I'll talk a little bit more later about that. These are just some more examples of take that we're dealing with, the big one being reduction in available habitat due to diversion of water. So background on our water system for any of you that don't know, and Becky's going to find this horribly simplified, but we are primarily a surface water system, and this map represents a philosophy change because I made this back when we were less focused on the anadromous reaches of our streams. So all the watershed boundaries end at our diversions. In fact, this one actually doesn't go, I think it's a little short of the Tate wells there, but the point, this was actually designed for source water protection purposes to get people thinking about everything up in this basin drains to this diversion point here.
Wow.
And basically 95,000 people are drinking that. So, but we're primarily a surface water agency. These streams all provide habitat for various listed species. Our watersheds are more or less urbanized, less on the north coast, obviously. The San Lorenzo does have a lot of trees, but it has quite a big population, and most of that population is along the stream corridors. It's an antiquated water system, vintage. We were talking about the 1880s diversions earlier, so it wasn't designed with the protection of listed species in mind. We have multiple jurisdictions in our watersheds. The city controls very little of our watersheds. And the data that we use to evaluate our watersheds and our effects from our diversions when we started this process, while it was fairly comprehensive compared to other watersheds, really didn't tell us much in terms of effects of our operations on these species. Just a little more background. We have among the lowest per capita water use. Some of you are city customers, and good for you for helping us be in the, the state board is really proud of us when we've met with them in the last couple months. They've always said that we're their role model and we wish other places could be like Santa Cruz, so that's good. But with our fish flows that we're going to put in place, and we have put in place in some cases already, we are facing a 1.2 billion gallon shortfall in worst case scenario. So this is, it's a big deal. The water supply alternatives that we're looking at are over $100 million, so that's kind of a big deal. Talk about more rate increases. And we do, as a surface water purveyor that represents the city of Santa Cruz and the surrounding area, obviously we share the ideals that the city and our customers have, and that means that we have values beyond provision of drinking water. We're a natural resource management agency, really, at this point. But like every other resource agency, we're challenged with climate change. I don't know if you can see this slide from a recent UCLA report down here. This slide I love because it sums up so much. A lot of climate science gets kind of geeky and hard to digest, but this right here, the incidence of extreme dry years by 2100 will increase almost 2 times. Extreme wet years, 2.5 times. The whiplash, which is what we really had with the drought, and then 2017 will increase 1.25. I don't know what the margin of error is, but severe storm sequences, 5-fold increase by 2100. These are all fairly severe shifts when you think about the time frame that species have evolved in. And you think about, PRBO has some vegetation maps and climate predictions, and they show in 2050 no conifers south of the Golden Gate. It's hard to wrap your head around.
Santa Cruz is supposed to have the climate of Ventura.
Yeah, and so one of my staff is at a Southern Steelhead conference this week, and some people are like, why'd you send them to Ventura? And I'm like, because those are the fish that are going to be able to live in Santa Cruz in 2100.
Interesting.
But, so we need long-term certainty for water supply, and we have challenges for biological conservation that, we need to recognize these issues while we're doing our planning. So species of interest, I won't name them all, and if I stole one of your pictures, I'm sorry, I couldn't figure out where I got all these pictures from in some cases, so photographers in the room, forgive me.
That's cool, so this is the whole list.
This is the whole list.
That's great.
And we'll get into this a little bit more in a future slide, but the list actually used to be about 3 times longer.
Oh. Okay.
So species of interest that we've spent the most amount of time on are obviously steelhead and coho, but we have spent quite a lot of time on red-legged frog and tiger beetle issues as well, for a variety of reasons, mostly because either our operations affect them quite a bit or they're just everywhere. In the case of tiger beetle, we could affect them because they're a very small population on the west side, and it just so happens our North Coast pipeline runs right through the middle of their habitat.
Oh, okay.
Ironically, the pipeline right away is actually better habitat than the surrounding open space because it's mowed and kept open.
Yeah.
I think we're out of Wilder also.
They are on the sort of east side of Wilder, Moore Creek Reserve, east side of Wilder, and then UCSC, I think.
So,
And then red-legged frogs are everywhere on the north coast, so every time we have a pipeline leak, we have to deal with red-legged frogs. And it's not so much that they're rare, locally at least, but they're, whenever it's wet, there's gonna be red-legged frogs.
so your previous slide of species of interest, are they all listed or
No, they're not all
they're
listed,
not all listed?
no. Lamprey's not listed. Pond turtle's not listed. I don't have all the species here, but, let's see. I guess it's just pond turtle and lamprey.
Okay.
We used to have a longer list that had maybe 10 unlisted species on it that we thought at some point might become listed. So we do have a Mount Herman June beetle HCP now, incidental take permit that we saw previously. Multi-species HCP with Fish and Wildlife Service has been in final review for quite some time. And because of workload and federal resource reductions, it's been bogged down a bit. And we're working on the administrative draft, an Salmon HCP now. We have agreement on the flow set and the monitoring plan and funding, and basically we're in packaging mode. And then we'll be going into CEQA and permit development, permit application development. Just to show how far we've come, this is a 1600 case that DFW filed against the city that this commission got, I think, 10 or 12 grand out of. Yeah. And Captain Kelly and I exchanged some stern words with each other out in the field because it was a bad situation. Anyway, I'd like to, Captain Kelly, it was nice that, I always look at that picture you took, Jody, where we were able to give him a proclamation and send him on his way when he retired, because obviously he dedicated a lot of his life to protecting our resources, and I respect that tremendously.
So is that 2010?
Yeah, the case started in 2008 and it was settled in 2010.
Okay.
But just, so
Yeah.
last spring, we're
Yeah.
working in partnership with our resource agencies.
Yeah.
There's been a complete leadership change in our department. There's
Yeah.
been an institutional shift in terms of our natural resource management obligations, and it's, I'll just say it's a much more pleasant place to work nowadays.
Yeah.
So covered activities, examples, we talked about this a little bit already, but this is the laundry list, and there's a few more. These are the big ones. This is where you would find, invariably, this guy, Billy, would call you and say, there's a frog in the bottom of the trench. And we would call Ventura and say, we don't have that take authorization yet, what do we do? And, we would find a workaround, but this is the kind of thing that we need take authorization for. This ditch right here, we netted thousands of red-legged frog tadpoles out of.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Wow.
No, it's on Highway 1. It's
Pipeline
a
repair.
leaky pipe from an ag field next to Lombardi Creek.
Mm-hmm.
So when you see water running down the side of those dusty paths on Highway 1, sometimes they're full of listed species. And the train tracks are full of frogs. All those cattails and puddles along the train tracks.
Yeah.
When the county first started talking about taking over the rail, I emailed Marty Wormhow and I was like, by the way, there's thousands of red-legged frogs on the train tracks, and there's fish passage issues at every stream crossing, so beware the Pandora's box of the rail trail.
Oh, mean it?
Yeah, and she said, thank you, I'll look into it. So our high priority activities are water diversion, pipeline repair and maintenance, and open space management. This is an example of a best practice here, just elevating the pipe so that frogs can go under it. And we use straw wattles that don't have, what's that?
Miniature wildlife.
Crossing.
Yeah, crossings. That's great.
Do they?
Oh yeah, this is a froggy site, this is Old Dairy Gulch. And using wattles that don't have plastic, you have plastic netting on wattles that can strangle amphibians.
Yeah.
So what are we doing? Avoidance and minimization, and that would be an example of avoidance and minimization. Providing better in-stream flows is avoidance and minimization of take, because you're reducing the amount of take. Using straw walls with no plastic is an avoidance and minimization. And then you're not obviously able to avoid and minimize all your effects because you still have to provide water for 95,000 people. So there's an inherent conflict there. Compensation for remaining biological effects. For the anadromous salmonid HCP is what we're calling the non-flow conservation fund. For the Mount Herman June beetle HCP, we have offsite mitigation in Bonnie Dune, adjacent to the Fish and Game Reserve. This is Jan Bentley, whom some of you know, was involved in the water transfer project, and this is the first time we released water on Laguna Creek, or anywhere for that matter, for fisheries. So that was kind of a big day. Here's an example
What
of
year
some
was
of, that was 2007,
Yeah.
yeah. In-stream flow improvements, we're prioritizing coho and watersheds where there's gonna be benefits for multiple species or for bigger runs of fish. Laguna and San Lorenzo. It's sort of interesting to me that when we first sat down with the resource agencies, we knew it was Laguna and the San Lorenzo as the top priorities, and then we studied it, and at the end of all the study, we came out with Laguna and San Lorenzo, so we felt validated, I guess. And we're addressing all life stages, but we're prioritizing limiting life stages, and that is usually summertime rearing in dry years, but it could be smolt out migration during the drought. That was a big deal. Adult in-migration during the drought was a big deal. So Laguna Creek, you can see particularly in dry and critically, well, in all year types in the summer, we're getting pretty good improvements. The blue line is unimpaired conditions. The red line is the operations as they were before we started putting in-stream flow in, and then the sort of dashed blue line is with the HCP flows.
Oh, that's cool.
So we are getting benefits in most cases. This is, at last night's meeting, I was telling people that in some cases, we actually have better conditions for coho with diversion, which is a bit of an anomaly.
Yeah.
And that's because coho do not prefer high velocities.
Right.
So if you can reduce the velocity, you actually benefit the coho, but that's a very rare circumstance.
And that's in those wet.
Yeah, and frankly, in those wet years, there really aren't issues like there are in other types of years. So these are the flow goals for Laguna Creek in the future. Right now, we have a 2 CFS rearing flow goal. We haven't had migration. However, there's only about 1 CFS in the stream, so there's just no diversion. And frankly, if we find other people are diverting, I'm gonna call Steve and you guys, and we'll talk more about that. That's never a happy time, but when we, as the city starts to put water back in the streams and spend over $100 million on water supply, we need to get pretty serious about what other folks are doing as well. So more in-stream flow improvements. Steelhead rearing below Tate Street's a big deal. During the late 80s drought, everyone has told me we dried up the river. The stream gauge, I think, has a couple zeros on it, I can't recall, but the Tate Street diversion water rights do not require a bypass flow. We are going to have a minimum 8 CFS there in the future, which is interesting because the Public Works Department now is designing a lagoon control structure, and they're wishing there was less water coming downstream.
Yeah, that's
So
true.
it's sort of a collision of circumstances, and again, that's why we want the left hand working with the right hand, because we need to make sure that it works for everybody.
Right. That's funny.
So particularly in the dry and critically dry years, for rearing, we're going to benefit steelhead pretty well below Tate Street. You can see as we get into wetter conditions, we do provide a higher rearing flow. We have a pretty interesting adult migration flow goal because some of the DFW biologists were not comfortable using a critical riffle approach, which is you take the most limiting riffle, and so they wanted to use sort of a bracketed approach where you have the most and the least limiting, and then you just sort of have that as your migration window. So this says 17 and 25.2 CFS, which means if we get a daily flow of 17 CFS, we basically say, okay, fish are moving, and we just basically say you're not going to divert below 25 until the stream has gone below 17 on its own, which is, I still can't explain that well. But
Yeah, okay.
for instance, right now the river's around 30, I think, and so for the next few days, if it's not going to rain, we're going to be keeping a close eye, and if it gets down to 25.2, I'm going to be telling the operators, you guys have to get off of the San Lorenzo River, and then they're going to start using Loch Lomond more.
Got it, until it naturally drops to 17.
Right,
Okay.
so, oh, that fish just wants to show up.
I know.
So
it's
just
cool
the
photo.
photos don't lie, and I'm so grateful for the California Coastal Records Project, and I wish they flew every year. But this was the year we did our first Gobi surveys in Laguna Creek. And there wasn't a lot to survey, and there was so little water, we actually found a human skeleton back here. I
Wow.
think someone thought that was a good place to put a body. Only it was,
2004.
they didn't realize that dried out. But it doesn't dry out anymore. And 2013 was a dry year, and we still had a big full lagoon because we were providing bypass flows. So
That's cool.
conditions have improved.
2013.
And there's the proof. We had coho spawning in Laguna 2015 and 16. And I took that picture myself. I was face to face with that fish in the water. So actually, I think in 2015 saw more coho than we did steelhead, which was
That's
kind of
so
nice.
cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So more compensation for remaining effects. This is our Bonnie Dune, Laguna Creek offsite mitigation. If we can't fully offset or minimize our effects on the species by making our practices more environmentally friendly, then we do some compensation for remaining biological effects elsewhere. So we put aside 17 acres in Bonnie Dune for I think 5 acres of impact at the Graham Hill Water Treatment Plant, and this habitat is way higher quality than the suburbia around the water treatment plant. The non-flow conservation fund, which I'll talk a little bit more in a future slide, that's going to be a big, hopefully, sort of impetus for regional conservation.
So did the service make you mitigate like to a 3-to-1 ratio, or did that just sort of work out? That was the
It kinda-
configuration of the
it kinda
parcel
worked
that was
out.
available, or the?
Well, it was less formal than that. We basically said, we have this property,
Oh, okay, got it.
and
Yeah. They just
does this
took
work?
it.
And they were like, yeah, that sounds good.
Okay.
And basically, you have extra if you have some other sandhills impacts. As it is now, we're talking about perhaps buying the Hanson Quarry for groundwater recharge purposes. So there might be some sandhills conservation benefits there too,
Neat.
and more partnership opportunities.
Yeah.
So this is city land,
This is city land
and it's where?
adjacent to the Fish and Game Reserve.
Okay. That's cool. So it looks like.
Yeah,
I didn't realize you actually had anything that wasn't in the right area. So,
yeah, it's funny, I mean, most people don't really know about it unless they're neighbors.
Which is
And it
what
probably
we-
never got on your radar because we never were logging it back in the day. But, yeah. So our non-flow conservation fund, this will be a fund that will support restoration from southern San Mateo County to probably Aptos Creek, not just in the creeks we work in, although that would be the preference, but we're working more in the ESU for fisheries. Because, we see fish from Pescadero in the San Lorenzo, we see fish from Soquel and Laguna, we're seeing fish moving all over. And we know that because we have pit tags and we have pit tag readers. And we have emails going back and forth all the time about, like, the NOAA people at the lab will say, hey, do you know this fish? And we'll be like, oh yeah, we tagged that in the San Lorenzo 2 years ago. And so it really does underscore the need to do regional restoration work.
That's great.
Again, guaranteed funding. Here we are with the bottom line.
And that comes from the local ratepayers,
Correct.
so we're paying a little extra to be environmentally sustainable.
Yeah, and I forget the percentage. We actually had our financial people figure out whether it's a 0.5% or a 1%
Yeah.
rate increase.
Oh, yeah, I think, right, I remember hearing that. I don't
Yeah,
remember what it
And
was.
Rosemary thinks that's sustainable and that people will support that. Although we have a huge capital investment program right now that, so people are definitely going to be feeling the hurt with the rate costs in the future. But we're working with as I said, a vintage water system and we have some modern needs. We do need to do infrastructure reinvestment to make this work for everyone. And I think this is a key point that shouldn't be missed is that
Yes.
Yeah.
with a pretty big pot of money that's guaranteed, for instance, the Resource Conservation District and other NGOs that do restoration work can focus on restoration work and not chasing grants. And they
Totally.
can also leverage other pots of money with this guaranteed funding. So I think it shouldn't be overlooked how beneficial that can be.
There's a
when
marketing
is-
opportunity around this, Chris, just for, to help make this bitter pill go down with the ratepayers more easily, yeah?
Yeah, I'm practicing this for our ratepayers, so thankfully you are one. You
Yeah.
can be our liaison.
Yeah.
How are you doing on time?
I probably need to speed this up, don't I?
Yeah, I was 10 minutes up of your.
Okay, I'll rip through the next few slides. So I recently presented at a Northern California Conservation Planning Partners conference, and my presentation was lessons learned. So I figured I'd leave a few slides in because, you know, you can't help but learn a few lessons, and some of them very hard. But I will focus on the next couple slides on some of the more, if I could get this mouse to work better.
I know, it's kind of a funky mouse.
Okay, science. So we found that best available science isn't always good enough. We had to do tons of data collection, and we had to fire some consultants who gave us bad advice. And we had to, you know, if you're doing, for instance, winter migration passage evaluations, you need the right flow to actually do those evaluations. If you're measuring, if you're looking at rearing, you need to have rearing conditions. If you need migration conditions, you need the flows to actually have the conditions that you're monitoring. So that can be challenging to schedule. But the plus side is when you have good information, it's easier to make decisions. You know, there's nothing worse than, and I have this problem too, if people come to me and want to make a decision and don't have good information, it's, you know, it's kind of hard to go there. So, sometimes you hear what you want. I mean, we were glad to hear San Lorenzo and Laguna were priorities because that's what we thought intuitively. Other times you hear things that maybe don't resonate so well, and that's challenging, obviously, especially when there's time and money and operational changes involved. And something I need to work on personally is communicating about this stuff. So again, I'm thankful that you are giving me the opportunity to practice, because sometimes we get in the weeds with our technical stuff and we forget that the rest of the world doesn't really care about rearing or what have you, but they do care about $100 million. So putting it in context where they can embrace it and understand it in a way that is meaningful is important. And just being open to learning new things. I mean, like the whole pit tag stuff has been amazing. At first we found all these pit tags we didn't know about, and then we realized it was people's pets swimming in the river in Felton. So, I mean, that's a lesson that's really not so important, but I mean, there's been all kinds of lessons throughout this process, so. And that's just to plug this event, which you guys funded the first annual edition of. The intent of the San Lorenzo Symposium was to improve scientific literacy of people involved in conservation around the San Lorenzo River. So that's what we're kind of getting at, science communications, and trying to get people on the same page about what what are we actually dealing with, and what are we talking about, and what are the priorities. Organizational issues have been huge in this process. Between having agency staff changes, that's been hugely upsetting. You know, we had new NIPS people come in after John Ambrose left, and Darren's great, but we had to basically teach him the whole HCP from the ground up. You know, agency dynamics, if they're not getting funded, or if there's not management buy-in at the agencies, that can be challenging. So we've had to, you know, at this point, we've met with, I think, 3 or 4 DFW directors and NIPS administrative staff and whatnot. And working with the field staff much more frequently and intimately, I think, has been helpful. Internally, having leadership down to the guys in the trenches buying into this has been, frankly, one of the biggest challenges. You know, obviously, management not buying in is they would do it for a different reason, but you know, when you have guys that have been doing the same thing for decades and they're all fishermen, they all think they know better, and they're not going to take it from college kids. I'm almost there. So getting people to buy into what we're doing and understand it and change their long-held habits has been a big challenge. Stakeholder partnerships has been something we've tried to work on over the years, especially as we move into implementation. We've started this thing called San Lorenzo 2025, we're trying to get, again, alignment around what our restoration priorities are and try to leverage funding opportunities by showing funders and legislators and whatnot that we're well aligned and we know what our priorities are and we're ready to go. And then, trying to synergize each other's efforts, so. And then the synergizing other operational needs. We are a surface water agency, and in my first job interview, they asked me, do you think watersheds that are good for cold water fisheries are good for drinking water? And I said, yeah, because cold water fisheries need clean, cold, well aerated water and functioning watersheds, and isn't that the kind of source watershed you would want for your drinking water? And that's true. So we have, as under the Safe Drinking Water Act, we play a role in watershed protection activities throughout our watersheds, and that has benefits for fisheries too. So those things kind of go vice versa, and we're hand in glove.
And what was the bear doing in the picture?
That's at the DFW office in Yountville, and I just thought that was funny because that's the former water director, and I just said, this project's a bear, isn't it, Bill?
Okay.
And he thought that was funny.
I think it's funny.
And that's one of my favorite places for meetings, frankly, if only because of the cool taxidermy.
Yeah.
So yeah, politics. This project involves water, so there's a lot of politics, and I won't get into that. But the politics start with the guys in the trenches, and they end with, Jimmy Panetta and Chuck Bonham and John Laird, and it goes to DC and to Sacramento. But it's politics with a big P and a little p, and I'm hopeful that we're moving in the right direction, both with water supply and with our fisheries conservation, so that we won't get derailed by the politics. But that's always, the politics are always in the room, and they're just part of the fun. So we need to recognize that and just take it as it comes and just be transparent and do the right thing. So I think just to,
For questions?
I will, yes. I literally have like 2 slides.
Okay, we literally have 2 minutes.
Okay.
30 minutes.
So public outreach, we've done a lot of public outreach, and there's a list of public outreach events. We'll be doing more, obviously, and coming up is NEPA and CEQA for 2 HCPs, Federal Register notice, which has a public comment period. State of the San Lorenzo this year in March, we'll likely talk about probably at least 2 of the HCPs. So there's been lots of opportunities in the past to engage, and there will be in the future. I think this is the 3rd time I've been here talking about this. Questions? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So.
Do you want access to your photos, or can I turn this off for questions?
It kind of depends on what the question is.
Okay, I'll leave it on.
Yeah.
I think a crew of associates there.
So, are there any questions that didn't get asked during the presentation?
So Chris, you mentioned that there was a longer list. But then it got pared down, so I didn't quite track that. Does the HCP cover a smaller subset of species now than when you originally set out to prepare the plan?
Yeah, so we had 30 some odd
Is
species,
it
and
cost or because you realize, the impacts aren't that great, it's not warranted?
well, it's both. The
Okay.
impacts weren't that great. I think we originally started out thinking, let's include every species that needs conservation, whether or not the city has an effect on it.
Yeah.
It was like, this is a habitat conservation plan, we should conserve all the habitat.
Yeah.
And then we learned a few lessons and thought, well, we really are getting take authorization. This is not it's a bit of a misnomer, a habitat conservation
Yeah.
plan. It's really a take authorization permit,
Right.
but it has a habitat conservation plan as part of it. So we were a bit idealistic and wanted to include basically every species that needed conservation, including some that were extinct.
Interesting.
And we were quickly disavowed of that when we realized what level of effort would go into that and what the likelihood of actually doing anything beneficial with that list would, it was fairly low likelihood. I mean, one thing that came up was, well, snowy plovers used to be on Main Beach in 1906, so we should bring them back to Main Beach. And it was like, really? How are we gonna do that?
Oh, wow.
And we quickly realized, in the meantime, we actually have some ability
Yeah.
to change in-stream flows in Laguna Creek, and we have a species there on the verge of extinction, coho. So, priorities quickly rose to the surface, and we narrowed down the list.
Yeah. Cool. And so it covers federal and state listed species? Or is it? Okay. And department decided not to do a natural community conservation plan, but just the HCP?
Well, so we're gonna get a 2081 permit probably through DFW,
Okay.
which is basically it's the equivalent of a federal, it's a little bit different, but it's like a federal HCP.
Okay.
But the terms will be the same. In the meantime, we're actually preparing stream alteration agreements for our 100+ conversions. I have a draft that will go out before the holidays, so,
Yeah. Cool.
yeah.
Well, and then my last comment, other people might have questions or comments. I really did like your last point that sort of a biodiversity ribbon watershed works for a water quality too.
Yeah.
And then the point about the leverage, the financial leverage, because of that money can leverage other like multi-benefit watershed restoration projects. That works for water quality and kind of resilience against climate change too. So I thought those were great talking points.
Oh, good.
So just encourage you
To work those a little bit more.
well, you covered it great, but it's just, just don't drop those if you run out of time, you know?
Okay, yeah, I should probably thin out a little bit of
Yeah.
the stuff up front to focus more on that, because I don't want to oversell that, but I think there is some real
Yeah.
potential there.
I thought the front though was a really great, you laid it out really cleanly about what it is, because it is, I mean, even I don't know the term super well, so you did a good job explaining how the incidental take and the HCP work together and stuff, so that was good.
Thanks.
I have to talk about the impact of climate change all the time, and I've never seen the stats you had, with the 1.8 times more likely, to
Yeah.
have, wet or drought kind of thing. I'd love to get a copy of that.
Yeah,
Okay.
Can you share this?
Yeah, that's Swain 2018 from UCLA, and I'll make it now. But we actually did a pretty huge, we created a whole hydrology data set based on some emission scenarios, which I hate to say based on the news yesterday are probably changing.
Yeah.
But we actually wrestled quite a bit with that because, where does it end with new emission scenarios? You kind of have to plan, you have to use the available science and then have enough adaptive management built into your plan so that you can respond to that if the conditions are different. And unfortunately, the conditions will likely not be better. And so unfortunately, in our case, if the climatic conditions are as bad as they maybe could be, we will see such wholesale changes that we probably will have to reevaluate our whole analysis. Because for instance, if salmon go extinct, which they could at least be locally extirpated because of water temperatures and hydrologic changes, that's such a game changer that you basically have to revisit everything.
Yeah, so once they die off, you won't have to take care of them. Is that the reason?
I don't think that's the answer, but I think that the take-home message is that, and this is why people don't want to embrace climate change, because it's hard. And also it's happening on a time scale that they don't really feel if they're focused on going to work and feeding their kids and paying their mortgage. They're not noticing, they're not micro-focused on the weather the way we are. Most people just don't see it. So I use this analogy all the time. It's like the frog in the boiling pot. They don't really notice until they're boiling. So anyway, the climate issue has been hard to deal with, as you know now.
It's hard to talk about that.
So unless there's anything else pressing on this right now, we're over time, and I know we've got a really full agenda. Going once?
I just had one question. What do you think will be the most difficult part moving the HCP forward?
The most difficult part? Well, I think there'll be two difficult parts. I think on the one hand, some folks will think that, we've been doing what we've been doing forever, so why should we change? And other people will think we're not doing enough. And there'll be enough infighting about that we'll get caught in the crossfire. So, I perhaps naively feel like if we do a good job of educating people and being transparent, reasonable minds will prevail and we'll move forward. But we do know that this is Santa Cruz and it's blood sport, right? So anything could happen.
It's the universe.
Thank you very
It's the
much.
human race, yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. This is great.
Okay.
Thanks, everyone.
Well, thank you, Chris.